Welcome to Reading Plan week number 11. And we have a special guest with us.
Hi.
In the studio. It's my
me.
wife, Dakota.
I am me.
And we're recording this on International Women's Day.
Yes.
So thank a woman next to you, around you, because without them, you wouldn't be here.
That's very true.
Yeah. So what better way to celebrate International Women's Day than having my favorite woman on the podcast?
I mean, I completely agree. I think this was a good decision on your part.
We planned it ahead of time, definitely. Well, you're going to guide us through the highlights and shadows and application this week. So let's start off with the highlights.
Okay, so the highlights, we're going to be in Exodus 20 for the highlight, and it is none other than the Ten Commandments. And I know you're thinking, I hear so much about the Ten Commandments. I see them on posters. I see them on signs. And why would this be a highlight? I already know about them. Well, that's kind of why it's a highlight. It's because they're very important.
Kind of a big deal.
Yeah, a little bit. So the second half of Exodus starts off with what we call the Mosaic Covenant. And it's covered in chapters 19 through 24. And the start of chapter 20 is Moses giving a directive from God that starts with the saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, the land of slavery. So he reminds them, before he gives them all these rules, that he saved them. He's the one who saved them from oppression and from slavery. Because if you listen to last week's podcast and did the reading last week, you will have read that the Israelites were a bunch of complainers and were asking to go back to Egypt at some points because, even though they were technically free, they were fed. Even if it was gross food, they were fed. They had a place to sleep. They knew where they were geographically. And there was just a bunch of unknown. And we as a people don't like not to know things or change, even if it's for good. We like to hold on to our crutches. So God has to remind the people that he is the one who brought them out of slavery. Also because they keep having to be reminded of this because nobody in that group who was alive had experienced life outside of oppression. They didn't know how to live free.
They were there 430 years.
Yeah.
Long time.
Yeah. So I don't think any one of them were 430-something years old. We might have been done with all of those really old ages by then. So God's reminding them of this because he's about to give them a fairly long list of rules. And so he's trying to remind them that this is not a new version of oppression, that they are free, but there are guidelines to being free. And the Ten Commandments is kind of the start of the consecration of Israel. And that's a big churchy word. Like the setting apart of Israel as its own nation, a nation that was governed by God and not just by a king, a nation that was governed religiously by Yahweh, by serving the Lord. And so that's what these rules were, that they were going to be a set-apart nation that lived differently than the other ones. And so it kind of starts off with the Ten Commandments. So you have it's 613 full laws, right? I think that's the number. It's over 600 laws in general. But the first 10 kind of cover all 613 in one way or another. And I thought about it kind of like when they were setting up America. We didn't just the people in charge didn't just say, go live. They had the Declaration of Independence, they had the Constitution, and the Constitution starts with the Bill of Rights. And so this is kind of like the Bill of Rights, but more of a bill of do's and don'ts.
Yeah, because it doesn't say in there, these are the Ten Commandments.
Yeah.
It's more like a constitution of their founding as a people.
Yeah. Because they had never really had these rules before. They they had just sort of the survival instinct. So instead of just having an instinct of survival, this is how they are to live their lives. And so I'm going to go through the 10 Commandments, and I figured, as a highlight, I've gone through this with my Sunday school class before, but there's a little trick that I've learned to remember the 10 Commandments, and I wanted to share that with you guys because what better way to remember than with an object lesson with our hands. So the 10 Commandments, we start off with one finger for the first one, and that is, do not have any other gods before me. And so number 1, there's only one God.
Only one God.
Number 2 is do not make an idol for yourself. And so you see how your middle finger is a little bit above your index, so we don't want anything to be above God.
Ah.
Yeah, I know. Then number 3 is do not misuse the name of the Lord your God. So you have 3 fingers, and we don't want to read between the lines of these fingers. That would be very bad.
Yeah, I get it.
Then we have number 4. Number 4, one of my favorites, is to remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. And so you see your thumb here is kind of taking a nap in the bed.
Oh.
So
Okay. Yeah,
rest.
it's kind of laying down.
Yeah, it's a day of rest to keep the Sabbath day holy because God rested. And then number 5 is honor your father and mother. And this is the only commandment that comes with a promise. And so, like, when you're making a promise to someone, you kind of, like, hold up your hand. You're like, I promise.
Oh, yeah.
So
I thought it was going to be like honor your father and mother, or they're going to slap you.
we had different parents.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, but I like I solemnly swear. Yeah.
Yes, and solemnly swear.
That one's better.
And then number 6, this is where we get creative because we have so many fingers. Number 6, we have a 5, and then we have a 1 because that's how math works. And it's do not murder. So it's a little pew pew.
Pew, pew.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I get it.
don't do that.
So with the one finger, you're shooting a gun at the other 5.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then number 7, okay, we have 5 fingers, we have 2 fingers. And this is do not commit adultery. So we have these 2 that kind of go away from the group, and you should not do that. Okay.
We get it.
Number 8 is do not steal. So we have 5 fingers and 3. Do not steal.
Yeah, so the 5 are grabbing the 3 and taking them somewhere.
And then 9 is do not bear false witness. And so we see that this hand is kind of hiding something from the other hand.
Oh, yeah.
And then number 10 is pretty easy. It's do not covet. And it's like the gimme hands.
Gimme hands, yeah.
Yeah.
Huh, I like that.
Yeah.
It's a good little tool there to remember all of them.
Yeah. So that's our highlight is, I mean, makes it a little more fun, but instead of just kind of like glossing over the 10 Commandments, because I feel like we see it so much that we can just be like, oh yeah, that's the 10 Commandments. Remembering that like this was the start of the nation of Israel.
Yeah, and this whole scene is like referenced, and all the 10 Commandments are referenced by Jesus, obviously, when in Matthew chapter 22, verses 36 through 40, the Pharisees ask him, what is the greatest of the law? And he says, the greatest law is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And then he said, the second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself, which goes back to Leviticus 19:18. And then again in Luke chapter 10, you have another reciting of boiling all 10 commandments down to these 2 commandments of love God and love neighbor, which is, if you look at the 10 Commandments, you have it broken down into the first 4
that's how
are
to love
about
God.
loving God. Then the other 6 are about loving neighbor. So that's how they get funneled down into these 2.
Yeah. And I like how bringing it to the Old Testament, relating it back to those 2 commandments, where how Jesus kind of shifts it, like he uses the word love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. He kind of reframes it for them because this is the version of the 10 Commandments that they know. And I feel like through time, their idea of the 10 Commandments was so warped into just do's and don'ts. That's how we get the Pharisees that are so harped in legalism when that's not what these were meant for.
Right. Yeah, exactly. All right, what's our shadow? Let's move along.
Okay, our shadow, I don't know that I'd really call it a shadow because it's hard to understand. I'm calling this a shadow because it's it makes it
Not well known.
it's not well known, and it makes you understand the book better if you step back and look at the whole picture. So we're in Nehemiah 1 in this week's reading. And in most modern Bibles, Ezra and Nehemiah are separate books. But when it was originally written, Ezra and Nehemiah were one book by a single author. So why is that important? This is not a complicated passage, Nehemiah 1, but when you step back and look at Ezra and Nehemiah as one book, you can see the parallelisms that flow through those two books to create the whole story, because the genre of these books are the writings, and some of them are kind of put into history writings, some versions of like the genres of the Old Testament. But I would even include it in kind of like a poetic type writing, even though it's about history, because of the way that it's structured. So Ezra Nehemiah has three main characters in it. We have Zerubbabel, we have Ezra, and we have Nehemiah. And so with each of these men, you get, number one, the king of Persia, who is moved by God to send a leader to Jerusalem. And then number two, we have each leader facing opposition to some form of rebuilding of the nation. So we have Zerubbabel, who wants to rebuild the temple. We have Ezra, who wants to teach the Torah. And then we have Nehemiah, who wants to rebuild the walls. So they all face some form of opposition to rebuilding, either spiritually or politically, militaristically, physically. And then in the end, they overcome that opposition, but kind of end in like a weird anticlimactic way. We're not going to get into number 3 because we're just in chapter 1. But Nehemiah 1 introduces us to Nehemiah, who is an Israelite serving in the Persian government. Because these books were written about 50 years after the Israelites returned to Jerusalem. And remember, like, not all of them returned. Some of them made lives in where they were exiled. And so Nehemiah is an Israelite official who's serving in the Persian government. And the first chapter starts off with him just absolutely broken at the state of Jerusalem's walls. In verse 3 and 4, it says, "They said to me, 'Those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire.' And when I heard these things, I sat down and I wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven." And that seems like a pretty extreme response to some walls being broken. Because you would expect the walls to be broken because they've only been back for 50 years. But what the walls of a city represented in an Old Testament city is way more than a wall means to us today. The walls of a city back then not only represented your political and your militaristic strength, but it also represented to other cities the strength of the God that city served. And so when Nehemiah breaks down to God about the walls, if you read chapter 1, he doesn't like first off ask for physical protection because he knows that the walls mean more than just that. He confesses the sins of Israel, which is just an interesting response to hearing about these walls being broken down. He confesses the sins of Israel, which is what God wanted the whole time.
Yeah.
He wanted them to repent. And so he starts off with acknowledging the wrongdoings of Israel for years and years. And he asks the Lord to remain faithful, even though he knows what they did was wrong. They were punished. And I think he has this hope now that they have been allowed to return, that maybe things will be different. And so he asks for favor from the Lord. And I think some of that favor probably includes physical protection, because at the end of chapter 1, he asks for to grant him success when he asks the king to go and rebuild the walls in chapter 2. And so I think that's kind of why I chose the shadow, because when you just read this, like we read Nehemiah, we went through Nehemiah 4 or 5 years ago with Pastor Tim. And so we just think Nehemiah is a book of names and genealogies and dates. And while it is a book of history, This is a book where the people of God are restoring the city to show and represent how strong Yahweh is. Because he has been so merciful and faithful to them when they did not deserve it.
Yeah, and it is different when they come back. I mean, because they never worship idols again after their return.
They learned their lesson.
that got whipped out of them.
Yeah.
You know. That's awesome. Let's move on to our application. What you got for us?
So our application, we're going to go back to Exodus, but a little bit before. We're going to be in chapter 18. And I've read this story before, and I didn't really catch this the first time. And it seems kind of maybe a little bit insignificant whenever you read it, because in chapter 18, we have this encounter with Moses and Jethro. And before that, we have the Israelites complaining. They're hungry, they're thirsty. They're like, Moses, are you trying to kill us? Like, where are you leading us? And then we have the Mosaic covenant. So it's like this little story kind of jabbed in between all that. And I don't know, I feel like this encounter is beautiful, it's impactful, and it has the potential to be impactful for anybody who's in ministry or serving the Lord in any way. Moses has a very special relationship with Jethro. It's his father-in-law, and he was a Midianite priest, but also he was a shepherd. And so, like, we know shepherds to be meek, gentle people. And because he was a priest, even though he was a Midianite priest, he has that air of wisdom. And so, like, halfway through this chapter, Jethro believes in the Lord. He says, I think it's in verse 11, when Moses is telling Jethro basically how the Lord has been so faithful through the wilderness. Also, I just want to say one thing. I don't know how Jethro found him, because they're wandering in the wilderness. Jethro just sends Moses a letter and says, "Hey, I'm going to come see you in the wilderness."
Yeah, there was no. I think when I was reading it, I was like, how'd they know where to meet up? Did they say? I mean, maybe they said beforehand, like, we're going to meet up here. You know, because where they're coming to is Mount Sinai.
Yeah,
that's where they're coming to. Like, I think that's where they are in 18.
Yeah,
where they're meeting.
I'm like, how'd you know he was going to be there?
Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, I'm sure a lot of things happened before this. Anyway, so they meet up. And Moses is just recounting the faithfulness of the Lord. And in verse 11, Jethro responds and says, now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, because he did wonders when the Egyptians acted arrogantly against Israel." And so right after this is when we get to our application. So right after this, Moses is sitting as judge for all the people. And not like some versions say he's sitting there judging people. It doesn't mean like he's being judgmental. It means he's actually acting as a judge. But he's hearing disputes and requests and complaints and acting as a mediator. It's basically like those movies where you see like the king sitting on the throne and just like the line of like peasants coming in and giving their requests to the king. This is what he's doing from dawn to dusk. And like, remembering that the Israelites were super complainers, I can only imagine how absolutely draining this had to be.
You're talking about a couple million people, too.
Yeah.
Here.
Yeah, this isn't like your small group.
Yeah.
This is a line of people every single day.
Because it was 600,000 men.
Yeah. And
I
that's
think.
Not counting women and children.
It was 600,000 men.
I think so.
Yeah, okay. I hope. Maybe it wasn't, but yeah. Drop a comment if it was if I'm wrong.
And so Jethro just like sits back and is watching him, and I think as a father-in-law, but also kind of acting as like the first pastoral counselor, he told Moses, "Why are you doing this yourself? You need to delegate." And I feel like as people in ministry, if you've ever, led a ministry or planned an event or taught a class or really anywhere that you serve, even if it's like behind the scenes, we know how hard it is sometimes to ask for help because we feel like we don't want to let people down. We don't know if other people are going to, perform to our standards or to the Lord's standards. And so we just avoid it and we selfishly think, well, I'm just going to do this all myself. And so, one of the reasons he was the judge is because he knew God's law. And so he could fairly do all this judging.
Right.
And so Jethro was like, you could teach other people the law. And then those people could help you.
Yeah, how about that? Boom.
I mean,
that's
mind
brilliant.
blowing.
Yeah.
In verse 17 and 18, it says that Moses' father-in-law said to him, the thing that you do is not good. Both you and these people who are with you will surely wear yourselves out. For this thing is too much for you. You are not able to perform it by yourself. And I think it's just a good reminder.
Yeah.
Like, to me, I think both of us are very much like, we're independent. We want to do the best job we can do. And sometimes for both of us, it's hard to ask for help. But Jethro reminds us, we are going to wear ourselves out.
Well, it's also a good reminder that you need people in your life who will be like, no, who will say no, and will say, are you sure about that? Are you sure you need to do this?
Yeah.
You need somebody who's like Jethro in your life to say, hang on a second, let's think this through before you launch off on this or you do this. And even if you're not like leading a ministry, having that accountability of somebody like Jethro to know that and recognize that, you're gonna end up being less effective in what you're trying to do for the Lord than, if you continue on, doing it in the way that you're doing it. And basically somebody to say, this is I'm seeing that you have a limit here.
Yeah.
And, just having that accountability in your life can be a game changer, because you can end up being more effective, for building the kingdom of God if you are not overdoing it and overextending yourself.
Yeah. And on the other side of that, if you're just someone who comes on Sundays for an hour, comes on Wednesdays for an hour, and you watch all these other people, if you're just a taker in the church and you see everybody else serving and, you're not serving, like, remembering that it takes people to make things run in a church, to run ministries, and God has called us to serve the church. Whenever at my home church, whenever I was growing up, the pastor would say, when someone joined the church, that God has called you to use your talent, your testimony, your time, and your treasures for that church. Not only is the church going to serve you, but you were called to serve the church, because the church is going to fail if everyone is just burned out and worn out. And so if you can step up, then you can be a part of continuing the legacy of the Lord and furthering the kingdom through your church.
Yeah. It's good stuff. Yeah, it goes along with Tim's message from last Sunday too about busyness.
Yeah.
So, well, thank you so much for being on the show.
You're welcome.
My lovely wife and Bible aficionado, and I learned something.
Wow.
With the parallel with
Nehemiah
and Ezra. And so thank you for coming on. This won't be your last time, I'm
Great.
sure, because we have many more to go. So that's another one in the books, and we will see you guys next week.